Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Kimberly Ovitz, and I'm currently calling in from Winnipeg, Manitoba, where I reside. I'm very pleased to be here tonight and want to start out by thanking all of the organizers for inviting me to present and all of the attendees for joining us this evening. For the next half hour, I'll be presenting on transdisciplinary research that I've been involved with in Alaska and the Canadian Arctic, both focused on beluga whales. Before I begin, though, I want to acknowledge and thank my extensive list of partners and collaborators that have supported this work. And this includes many individuals at NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and then many people from the communities of Kenai, Anchorage, and Paulatuck in the Northwest Territories. So to provide you a little bit of background on myself, I am a wildlife researcher specializing in participatory and community engaged research and monitoring. I'm originally from Chicago, and I have a bachelor's degree from the University of Massachusetts and a master's from the University of Maine. The first was focused on political ecology, and the second on fisheries and conservation of the marine environment. I've since worked in a variety of ecosystems and on many different projects, including projects on fishes in large rivers in North and South America, invertebrates in coastal Maine, and then on projects relating to whale sharks in coastal Mexico. Currently, I'm pursuing a PhD on belugas at the University of Manitoba in Canada. So in this talk, I'll start out by providing a brief overview on beluga whales more generally, and then I will share a few examples of beluga research that I've supported involving two very different beluga populations in two very different sociocultural contexts. And after that, I'm happy to close and answer some audience questions. So let's begin with just a few of the basics. Belugas are a medium-sized toothed whale in the family Monodontidae alongside the narwhal, pictured here on the lower right. And in 1776, Prussian scientist Peter Pallas first described belugas in the literature, giving them the name Delphinapterus leucus as their scientific name. However, hundreds of years before this scientific name was first applied, belugas were known to indigenous peoples by other names like Killalagak, or beluga in Inuvialuit, which is a dialect spoken in Canada's Western Arctic by the Inuvialuit. Beluga have various adaptations that enable them to thrive in the Arctic and subarctic marine environments. Some of these notable adaptations and characteristics include the melon, which is that large mass of adipose tissue on the beluga's forehead. And this is what they use to channel sound and find food for echolocation, as well as to communicate with other belugas. They also have unfused neck vertebrae, which is what allows them a lot of flexibility of their head and neck. They're also white in color, which enables them to blend in with the ice and hide from predators in Arctic environments. And then notably, they don't have a dorsal fin, which enables them to more seamlessly travel in heavy ice conditions. So adult belugas can measure up to 16 feet in length and weigh up to around 3,000 pounds, with males tending to be slightly larger than females. So we do see a little bit of sexual dimorphism there. Initially, it was thought that belugas lived to be around 30 years of age. However, recent studies have actually indicated that belugas can live to be a lot older than that, up to around 80. And even recently, with some sampling in the Western Arctic on the Beaufort sea population, we see a whale that was around potentially 100 years of age. So they do have a very long lifespan and one that is somewhat equivalent to humans. Female belugas reach sexual maturity around 9 to 14 years of age, and then they give birth to one calf every 2 to 3 years. The newborns are born dark gray, and they eventually lighten over time to the very bright white that we know belugas to be as adults. So you can see some of this here in the image with the very bright white adult on the left in the middle of the screen, and then a juvenile as that kind of more gray color, and a younger whale, a calf, as the very dark gray on the right side. Beluga whales are distributed throughout the Arctic and subarctic waters, and they primarily occur in areas with seasonal ice cover, as you can see in the distribution of beluga stocks here on the right. Currently, science estimate that there are 180,000 belugas globally across 22 recognized stocks, and these stocks are defined by and delineated by genetic and migratory patterns. So even though some of these stocks overlap parts of the year and parts of their range, they are genetically distinct and have separate wintering or summering areas than other stocks. Most beluga populations are migratory, meaning that they migrate between different winter and summer ranges. However, some populations are actually year-long residents within one range, and that would be like the Cook Inlet population in Alaska or the St. Lawrence Estuary belugas in Canada. And these populations are smaller, and even though they might have kind of finer scale distributional shifts in the winter as land-fast sea ice or ice might form in nearshore areas, they don't make long migrations like we would see, for instance, in some of the northern Alaskan populations. Currently, the largest beluga stock is located in Canada's western Hudson Bay, and this contains about 54,000 belugas. There are other stocks, however, that are thought to be extirpated or extinct, and this includes the Ungava Bay and Cumberland Sound stocks. So belugas are opportunistic feeders, and this means that they target a wide range of prey depending on what's available. And this includes finfish like salmon or cod and capelin, and they also sometimes consume invertebrates like marine worms and snails. Some of the belugas we see in the Canadian Arctic show up with hard octopus or squid beaks in their stomachs, and so they also eat those depending on where they're located. During the ice-free months, belugas are often found in shallow nearshore environments, and this includes in estuaries and rivers, river mouths. And they can also be found in deeper waters offshore, where they can make dives to the ocean bottom up to 1,300 meters depth, 1,300 meters of depth. Presumably when they're doing this, they're feeding on benthic prey like Arctic cod. On various occasions, belugas have also been sighted hundreds of kilometers up rivers in completely freshwater environments in Alaska, Russia, and in Canada. As waters tend to freeze in the fall, migratory beluga stocks will then return to their wintering grounds or to more offshore areas free from land-fast ice. So the threats facing beluga populations vary spatially and temporally. However, some of the key threats affecting belugas include shipping, for instance, like the opening of the Northwest Passage under climate change. And shipping activity can cause disturbance and displacement of belugas and also release noise into the marine environment that makes it difficult for belugas to communicate and echolocate, which they use to find food. Climate change is also a huge stressor that can result in things like habitat loss and physiological impacts. Contaminants, for instance, like mercury, is also a threat in some environments, as are activities like large-scale commercial fishing, which might cause competition over prey. So many populations are also facing cumulative impacts wherein multiple of these stressors are interacting and affecting beluga populations. And that's something that varies over different times of the year and over different regions. So obviously the same kinds of threats that we might be seeing in Cook Inlet may differ from those that we're seeing in Arctic environments. So moving on to a little bit of my research approach and the methods that I typically use in my work. There are many different ways to study the marine environment, and folks here tonight might be a little more familiar with some of the highly scientific methods used to study cetaceans, like genetics and tagging. And this is all very important work and very valuable for understanding marine species health and physiology and their movements. But this type of work is not always very accessible, and often it requires a lot of significant expertise in niche fields. So in contrast to that, my work tends to be very transdisciplinary and a little more accessible. And transdisciplinary means that I'm bringing in collaborators, not just from different scientific or research disciplines, but also from different worldviews that have different types of expertise. So this could be, fishermen working with us or knowledge holders from indigenous communities, people who bring in stakeholder knowledge that extends beyond the realm of academia. And the type of work that I do tends to be community engaged, so very participatory and collaborative, and focuses on more local, sometimes up to regional scales. I also try to bring in collaborators from different disciplines using a range of different methods, typically non-invasive methods, and this could include methods from the natural and the social sciences. So oftentimes I use interviews and workshops in tandem with things like field methods, and that might be like using drones or passive acoustics to monitor the marine environment. And together, by bringing in all of these different but complementary data sources and bodies of knowledge, we're able to produce a more enriched picture and a holistic understanding of the phenomena and the spaces that we're studying, as is kind of highlighted in the figure here on the screen. Some of the core themes that I'm interested in exploring and tend to explore include environmental baselines, benchmarks, and changing conditions, as well as wildlife movements, behavior, and habitat use. So one of the frameworks that I draw from in my PhD is called the Knowledge Co-Production Framework. As defined by Yua et al. 2022, knowledge co-production is the process of bringing together two different knowledge systems in true partnership and equity to enhance, learn, and create new understandings on a specific topic. And this is something that guides a lot of my current work, and this knowledge co-production refers to a process of collaboration that is extending across research phases. So it's not just working with people to identify a question or to be information providers, but actually working in true partnership and emphasizing things like equity and relationship building and reciprocity. So even though our central goal might be to explore belugas and to learn about belugas in the marine environment, we still want this research process to produce more than knowledge of wildlife. And most importantly, we want to make sure that this process does not cause harm to our collaborators and the communities in the areas that we work with. As I mentioned earlier, much of my work involves using non-invasive methods such as shore-based monitoring, and now I'm relying more on emerging technologies like drones to study belugas. So small drones, one of the ones we use is pictured here, are accessible tools that are increasingly being used to study wildlife movement, behavior, and health. And what's great about this process and the footage that it produces is that anyone can do this. Anyone can have a small drone if you have the right certifications and use that for different purposes. But the outputs that it provides are very engaging and are really useful for bridging different types of knowledge, spurring conversation, and supporting processes like collaborative sense making. So now I'll transition into sharing some examples of the beluga research that I've been involved with. And like I said before, I'll be describing two different case studies from two very different beluga populations and regions. The first that I'm going to talk about is belugas in Cook Inlet in Alaska, which is pictured here in the lower bubble on the screen, followed by belugas from the eastern Beaufort Sea population, which we're studying in part of the Beaufort Sea called Darnley Bay. So to provide a brief overview on Cook Inlet belugas, this is a small endangered beluga population estimated to contain about 331 whales. Belugas in Cook Inlet are non-migratory, meaning that they reside there all year round, and they're active in nearshore environments during the ice-free months, specifically around river mouths and streams. They're also located close to a major population center, at least in terms of Alaska standards, and this is the city of Anchorage. As such, there's a lot of competition for space and resources with people in this environment. So Kenai River is Alaska's most heavily fished river, and it is a glacially fed river that flows into central Cook Inlet. You can see the little dot on the map there. And it is home to 40 species of fish, including many key beluga prey. The lower river is also designated as critical beluga habitat. And 5 years ago, when I first started a fellowship with NOAA, we were interested in looking at this river in tandem with another project that Suzanne, who presented earlier, was facilitating at the 20 Mile River, which is closer to Anchorage. And we were interested in kind of using this as a way to understand how belugas are using different rivers in the area. But we were especially focused on Kenai because it's a place where the literature suggested belugas used to frequent, but may no longer be as active at. So this led us to several research questions, which included, are belugas still using the Kenai River? And if so, when, where, and how many? And what stressors are they exposed to in this area? So to answer this question, or these questions, we developed a project that involved participatory shore-based monitoring and interviews with 22 stakeholders and longtime residents of the Kenai area who had knowledge on beluga activity and other dynamics at this site dating back many decades. And so with this, we ended up conducting 83 monitoring sessions over 74 days at 6 different sites, and 10 different individuals from the community ended up assisting with monitoring efforts. So here are the different sites that we were monitoring at in red, and this extended from the river mouth all the way up to 6 or 7 miles upstream. And we actually ended up seeing belugas at all of these different areas. So initially when I went down to this site, it was winter, and I was hearing from my colleagues that, belugas really don't seem to be using this area very much. We don't get many reports of belugas in the Kenai River, and you might go down there and see nothing at all. So I could have spent, 3 days or 3 months monitoring the site and not really seeing a lot of activity. When I arrived, it looked like this very cold kind of winter site. And by the time I left, thankfully, it was a lot warmer and a lot nicer to do monitoring at. But I did go down knowing that this might kind of be a futile effort and that we might not see anything, at least based on the general narrative that persisted at the time. Fortunately, though, we did end up seeing a lot of activity, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. But in addition to monitoring beluga whale movements in this area, we were also looking at fluctuations in human activity and site use to try to understand, like I said, what stressors are belugas being exposed to, but also how might human activity influence beluga timing and use of this site. So belugas were first observed from project monitoring sites in the Kenai River in March, on March 23rd, and we saw them on 31 days total during our monitoring period. And they were observed in high ice cover as well as in no ice cover. Group sizes ranged from 1 to 27 with a mean of 9.73, and 80% of the beluga groups that we observed contained more than one age class. So we were often seeing adults and juveniles or adults and calves. Belugas were observed from all 6 project monitoring sites, and the greatest number of group sightings actually happened up at our furthest upstream site, Site 6 at Cunningham Park. And this was sort of not something we anticipated, because we were thinking, belugas might not use this space at all, but if they do, they probably come in and stay kind of in the river mouth, but that's not true. All the groups that we observed at our Site 6 were actually in transit to a further upriver destination that we weren't able to observe them at, and they remained up in that area for an hour or more before traveling back downriver. And the furthest group sighting we were actually able to observe firsthand was at river mile 8.5, and historically they have potentially gone all the way up 17 or 20 miles upriver towards the community of Soldotna. So as I mentioned, we did facilitate 22 interviews with stakeholders and longtime residents, and these interviews really helped us kind of contextualize what we were seeing and identify baselines and benchmarks and changing conditions that related to the social ecological dynamics of the Kenai River, at least in the area that belugas are active. So just 2 examples of quotes that we received from participants included, "Fall is a critical time for belugas, and we see the same thing in spring. What's missing is that I used to see the same number of whales in July before the personal use fishery and before the beluga population crashed. I've seen 30 to 40 whales in the river in July when the population was feeding every night, and you don't see them now. What's excluding those whales from here?" And another individual said, "Well, if they want to come here in July, no way. I just cannot imagine it really. There's just no room in the water, and that's primarily related to the personal use fishery." So if we go back to that slide showing the differences in human activity in May and June, July is even a little more intense than what we're seeing in some of these. And the human activity really changes over time. And these narratives that we're hearing from interview participants kind of help us contextualize that and really complement what we might be seeing with the monitoring. There were other quotes as well in the transcripts that came out to say, there's some targeted harassment that might be happening. Competition with prey could be something to consider. So these interviews identified different stressors that researchers might want to look at in the future in terms of understanding beluga use of this space, but also conservation and recovery and how that can be possible in a site where a lot of human activity is occurring. So some of the key outcomes from this project that I'm really excited about are just the recognition of the Kenai River as an important beluga habitat that supports activities like foraging. So before There was sort of this general notion that belugas weren't very active in this area. A few people knew about them and saw them regularly, but many did not, even people who had lived in Kenai for a very long time and were active in this area for decades. And it was really neat to see sort of this awareness increase around beluga activity in this area, but also excitement and pride around having belugas in this area and support for beluga conservation and recovery emerging. We've also seen this sort of as a stepping off point and a foundation for longer term efforts in the region, including systematic monitoring, additional research, including acoustic research in the Kenai River, and the increased reporting of opportunistic sightings for this area. So since this project occurred, it has expanded into part of the Alaska Beluga Monitoring Program, which I was a part of a few years back as well. And this is one of the key sites that's now monitored every fall and every spring. So 5 years ago, I was sitting alone in the snow, watching belugas on the bluffs of the Kenai River, and now I can sit at home in Winnipeg and receive text updates on beluga activities at the site. So it's really neat to see how this has evolved and expanded over time, and just the immense amount of public support and participation that is now involved in this area. So switching to another case study on the Western Arctic and the Eastern Beaufort Sea population. The Eastern Beaufort Sea, or EBS beluga population, is a large and healthy population estimated to contain around 30,000 whales. So in contrast to the Cook Inlet population, this population is doing very well. Also different from Cook Inlet, this is a migratory population that migrates annually thousands of kilometers from its wintering grounds in the Bering Sea to summering areas in the Beaufort Sea. This population is also formally co-managed by Inuvialuit, which are the Inuit of Canada's Western Arctic, and the Government of Canada per a land claim agreement signed in 1984, which is the Inuvialuit Final Agreement. So just to provide a closer up of the study area, I am working with the EBS beluga population, but we are looking at them at a fine scale in Darnley Bay and the Angoniakea-Nakikwa Marine Protected Area, which is near the community of Paulatuk, which is a small fly-in only community with around 300 people. So Inuvialuit have resided along the Beaufort Sea coast for centuries and are the traditional stewards of this area and its wildlife populations. Traditionally, Inuvialuit society centered around seasonal wildlife harvest, and this remains central to Inuvialuit identity and cultural continuity today. Beluga in particular, or Kilalagak in Inuvialuitan, is a particularly important focal species in the region and has been for hundreds of years. Inuvialuit possess in-depth environmental knowledge on beluga and ecosystem processes acquired through experience on the land and through intergenerational knowledge transfer. And this knowledge, which I'll refer to as IK, is place-based, adaptive, and reflects a very long temporal scale that extends back many generations. So what's fantastic about this is it's really complementary to Western science, in that Western science methods are often used over a shorter period of time and only give us kind of a snapshot into what's happening in an environment. And then we can look to IK and IK holders to say, can we contextualize this more and kind of understand more holistically what's happening in this area? Inuvialuit have been particularly interested in bridging IK and Western science to understand wildlife. But interestingly, this is also mandated under that land claim agreement I mentioned, which requires that IK inform both research and management in the region. So this is all the backdrop for the project that I've been working on, which is the Paulatuk Beluga Drone Project. And this is a collaborative project exploring nearshore beluga whale activity in Darnley Bay and the Angoniakea-Nakikwa Marine Protected Area. This is a partnership between the Paulatuk Hunters and Trappers Committee and researchers from DFO, as well as with support from researchers at the University of Manitoba and Natural Resources Canada. And through this project, we're employing field methods and qualitative inquiry to co-produce and contextualize knowledge on belugas. So the project was first proposed in 2020 and then was developed over the subsequent 2 years. And it initially was proposed because there was an interest at the community level in using drones to visually document and augment local knowledge and observations of beluga, as well as to address persistent knowledge gaps in Darnley Bay and the ANMPA. So together we formed a transdisciplinary team and a group that could design and implement this research that has since been guided equally by Inuvialuit knowledge and Western science. So here's sort of a schematic of our collaborative design process, wherein our northern team members and our southern team members come together and contribute knowledge, experience, and values and goals towards all the phases of our research process, which include question framing, objectives, methods, interpretation, and reporting. The field methods that we're using are from both the natural and the social sciences. And the first phase of this will consist of data collection on Beluga using collaborative environmental field methods. And this includes drone surveys, acoustic monitoring, and experiential learning, or learning by doing out in the field. And then here's a flow chart representing that. So once we collect that field data with the drone surveys and the acoustics and the visual observation, that produces outputs that include Beluga imagery, both aerial videos and photos, coastal imagery, and acoustic data. We'll then analyze some of that using behavioral analyses and photogrammetry, as well as participatory analyses. And when we have those outputs, we will bring them to the community in a workshop and interviews to interpret and reflect on our findings. So it's this cyclical process involving collaboration at all phases. Another method that we're using is coastal erosion mapping. So when we're out there, we're not always seeing belugas, but we still want to make use of that time and the tools and the skills that we have in that area. So when we are there, but we're not seeing belugas, we're flying mapping surveys to map coastal erosion and slumping in nearshore areas. One of the things I love about this project is we all came in a little bit new to drones and to using them in this context. And so we've all been able to learn that and get certified together. So we're currently working with a team of 4 people, 2 researchers from the South in Canada, which is like the Winnipeg area, and then 2 Inuvialuit wildlife experts from the community of Paulatuk. So all of us were trained either in basic or advanced drone operations, and then have since really learned together and perfected our techniques in the field. So study sites that we're looking at here are 6 different sites, and these were all selected by knowledge holders, and they include areas of known importance for beluga, for instance, like sites that support rubbing or foraging or other activities. And these were all identified in team meetings and workshops with knowledge holders before the project began. On the right there, you can see an image of our field camp at one of our sites in the lower part of Darnley Bay. Figured I would just share a few photos from the field to kind of contextualize the work that we're doing. We were really fortunate this year to be able to have some helicopter time to visit sites that we normally are not able to get to. Some of the sites that are further up in the bay are much, much harder and not as safe to travel to. So we used a helicopter to look at beluga distribution across the entire coastline and access sites that we normally would have a hard time getting to by boat. What's really neat about this area is the southern part of Darnley Bay looks much more flat like this. And then the northern part, the habitat really changes, and it's very sheer cliff faces that meet this very, very clear water. So a lot of the areas that belugas are active, at least in places like Cook Inlet and the Mackenzie Delta, the water is very, very turbid. It looks kind of like chocolate milk. And it's very hard to see belugas using a drone, but Darnley Bay is very, very clear. It looks like Caribbean waters, and it makes it a lot easier to see beluga activity at the water surface and even with a few feet below. A lot of our work is done at campsites, and so we'll go up in this area for 7 weeks and then work with our local team members to monitor different areas, to do drone surveys at different areas, and deploy hydrophones at different sites. So as I mentioned before, this project is in progress, and a huge, huge component of this is bringing all of these outputs to community members to interpret and reflect on later. So I don't have findings to share with anyone here today, and once we do have final findings, we will hopefully be providing those insights in scientific journal articles and in other more accessible forums that will be available online. But for now, I can just share a few quick photos and videos of some of the things that we saw. So the outputs that we have produced through this project are extensive aerial imagery to augment local knowledge, but we also made some unexpected observations that we really didn't anticipate. And some of that is unique behaviors that we hadn't heard about before that surprised some of our local collaborators and local knowledge holders. And just the fact that we were seeing a range of group sizes, but we saw a lot of individual whales by themselves. And this is something that I think people in the area were surprised by. So it was really interesting to be in the field and be able to document this very important knowledge that people already had, and also to make some new observations and insights that maybe were a surprise to all of us. We did observe belugas across all of our study sites, and the group sizes typically ranged between 1 and 50. We did observe a few larger groups as well, of up to around 200 whales. Most of these groups that we observed contained a mix of age classes, but not all. Some just contained adults. We did also see a range of behaviors and body conditions. I'll show you a few examples of these on the next slide. So one of the outputs that we're generating is high definition aerial images using a Mavic 3 RTK, or the Enterprise drone. And this allows us to calculate beluga lengths and widths within 2 centimeters accuracy. So it's pretty neat that we can use this to do measurements and to look at things like body condition and girth. But it also gives us very, very high definition and clear imagery of notable markings and scars and skin condition and where belugas are at in the molting process. Molting is when they shed their skin annually. You'll kind of see it slough off, or you'll see them rub along the substrate where they're getting rid of that skin. So using this drone is helping us to look at body condition in this area. And you can see even here, just kind of a range in the skin condition of these whales and different markings that we're interested in looking at and talking to knowledge holders about. And then another one of our outputs, of course, is the aerial video. And we've been able to capture video across all of our different sites and see how beluga are interacting with the environment. So here you can see a beluga in probably about 4 or 5 feet of water, rubbing along the substrate to slough off that skin, as I mentioned. And then you see the same thing here, but at a different site. Rubbing was a very, very popular activity, and we saw this in a number of different places, but especially in the southern part of Darnley Bay, where there's a lot of this sort of sandy gravel bottom. Another behavior that we saw that we were surprised to see was play. At least we think that's what this was. We ended up watching this whale for 40 minutes with this flounder. And initially we had thought maybe it was going to consume the flounder, but over the entire time that we were watching it, it just played with it and would throw it back and bring it back again. And it seemed more like a social play behavior than a foraging behavior. And then we also saw socializing or group activity where whales were coming together and making ventral contact and kind of rolling around with one another. And that's something that we saw more so in the northern part of the bay at our northern sites. And then, as I mentioned, we have the acoustic recordings that we're able to pair with our video. So this is just an example of that. So by having these acoustics paired with the aerial video, this allows us to provide kind of a more holistic understanding of what beluga are doing below the water that we can match with what we're seeing them do from an aerial perspective. And it also helps us to cross-validate our findings between data sources, as well as fill gaps related to beluga presence and movement patterns. So the acoustics are constantly recording, or they're at least recording for a certain amount of time every hour. And the aerial surveys we're only doing certain times of the day or certain times in the month. And so having this acoustic recording happening more frequently will let us know, are we missing belugas at certain sites? Is there more activity happening in a certain area around a hydrobone that we were unaware of because we weren't there? And so we'll be looking to pair these different data sources in that way. And as I mentioned, the next steps are, of course, to bring all of this back to our collaborators, do some preliminary analysis and interpretation, and then produce final products later on. So with that, I want to thank all of you so much for attending tonight. And I want to thank again our organizers for having me present. And I want to thank most certainly all of our collaborators and partners for their support and all of my team members in both Canada and Alaska. Thank you. If anyone wants to get in contact with me, here is my information. Thanks so much.